All right, so chapter 12 deals with sample surveys, and there is a lot of vocabulary in this chapter. You might want to have your reading guide out, and you'll see as I go through this that you probably can answer some of the questions on the reading guide. So, talking about sample surveys. I'm going to give you kind of a little example here. Suppose we wanted to find out if high school students in America approve or disapprove of enforcing strict immigration laws in the US. So this has kind of been a hot topic in the past several years. So what if we wanted to find out what high school students in America thought? Well, one of the vocabulary words we're going to have is the population. And in statistics, the population represents the entire group of people, animals, or things about which we want information. So in this case, what's our population? Well, hopefully you're thinking high school students in America is our population because that's who we want the information about. So all the high school students in America would be our population. So a census, which you actually probably have heard about recently because every 10 years in the United States, they attempt to do a census where they gather data from everyone in the United States. So that's information that you gather from the entire population. But it would be way too costly and time consuming to use a census, and it would probably take so long that some of those students would no longer be high school students. So what we do instead, because a census is not reasonable, is we take a sample of the population. So a sample is when you take a part of the population from which we actually collect information used to draw conclusions about the whole. So instead of talking to all the high school students in America, we come up with a sample. But there's certain ways that we want to come up with a good sample, and then there's certain ways that you come up with a bad sample that we hope to avoid. So could we interview all students at Delphus Jefferson High School to obtain our sample? Well, no, because we want to know about all high school students in the United States. Well, Delphus Jefferson High School is not representative of all United States high school students. Students in large cities may feel differently. Ethnicity is not representative in Delphus as it is in the United States. So one very important thing is you want to make sure that whatever sample you are drawing to gather your information, you need to make sure that your sample represents the population that you're trying to get information about. So what we call that selection bias or undercoverage. And if you think about the word undercoverage, it kind of makes sense because we're not covering the entire population because we're not sampling with a representative sample. Suppose we only wanted to know opinions of Delphus Jefferson High School students. So now instead of wanting to know about the entire United States, what if I only want to know about our high school? Well, one thing we could do is we could send out a questionnaire and ask students to put their completed surveys in a box in the office. Or I should probably update this and say we could send every student a Google form and ask them to complete it and submit their results. But you know that not everybody's going to do that. So we call that a voluntary response sample. And this is biased because a lot of times what can happen is only students with very strong opinions will respond. And you see this a lot with voluntary response sample where people have the option to respond to something. And a lot of times that can overestimate a percentage of what people think because only people with strong opinions that care enough to respond are going to do that. So what if we interviewed students in the cafeteria before school? Okay, pre-COVID, remember that students gathered in the cafeteria before school. Let's pretend like that's the situation. Would this give us a good sample? Okay, what if we did that? Well, no, because some students might go directly to their class. The interviewer might only approach people that they feel comfortable with, but really one thing I think about with the cafeteria is the students you would find there before school were always freshmen and sophomores that couldn't drive, and they rode the bus. So we tended to have a lot more younger. I mean, there were some upperclassmen, but typically it was a lot younger classmen that were in the cafeteria. And then this other thought about only approaching people that they feel comfortable with. If you were going to survey people at our school, you're probably going to go to your friends. You're going to go to people that you don't feel intimidated by. This is called convenient sampling. And that, if you think about that it's very convenient. So a lot of these vocabulary words make sense. It's a very convenient way to sample, to just go to the cafeteria and ask people. But you're going to end up with a biased, biased meaning that you're not going to get accurate results when you do that. So suppose that we are able to interview 100 students. How can we ensure we get a good sample? Well, we could get a list of all the students. I've done this before and gone to Mrs. Rohde and asked for a list of all the students, and we would call this our sampling frame. And we're going to use our sampling frame to select our sample. We could number each student, depending how many there were, but suppose there were 300, from 001 to 300, and we could use a random number generator to select a sample of 100. Now, if you were doing this with a random number table, you would have to use the digits 001 to 300, and remember, you'd have to throw out 301 to 999. If you're doing this with technology, then you could just go from 1 to 300 and have it randomly select 100 digits. Now remember though that they would not be able to repeat. You would have to throw out repeats, because once a person's chosen, they can't be chosen again. This is called a simple random sample. And it's a simple random sample. Two things have to be true. Every individual has an equal chance of being selected, and every possible sample of size 100 has an equal chance of being selected. So both of those things have to be true in order for it to be a simple random sample, but we'll be talking a lot about simple random samples. So what if we thought there might be a difference among grade levels? Okay, well that kind of makes sense. We could divide the population into groups of similar individuals, and we call that strata. In our case, we have 4 strata: freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And so if you think about this idea with the immigration laws, a lot of times freshmen and sophomores might not be very politically aware. They might not be very globally aware, whereas when you're a junior and you're starting to take government classes, and as a senior, so you start to think a little bit more, and you're starting to vote, you think more about those things. So that's why it might make a difference among grade levels. So if we split them up into what we call strata, based on some similar characteristic, in this case by their grade level, then what we could do is we could choose a simple random sample from each stratum, is singular. It doesn't have to be the same number from each group. And this question here, is this a simple random sample? Why or why not? It's actually, you can have a simple random sample within the group, but it's not, once you do that, it's not a simple random sample, because even though each individual has the same chance to be chosen, each sample does not. For example, you can't get a sample with only juniors and seniors, because we are ensuring that we're going to take some from each stratum. So it's not possible to have all the different, the groups don't have the same chance of being chosen. So that's why it's not considered a simple random sample. But it's still a good sample if you are choosing within each grade level. If you're choosing a simple random sample within the grade level, it's still a good sample. So once we've chosen our sample, how will we gather our data? Well, one option is we could send questionnaires to 100 students in our sample. A major problem that interviewers encounter is non-response. So this creates a bias that as we said earlier, because people with strong opinions are more likely to respond. So we have to have some way that we can ensure that we can contact the people who don't respond. So the questions on the survey can affect the response. So consider the following questions. Senator Herbert Lehman once said, America was settled and peopled entirely by immigrants and built to greatness by immigrants. Do you agree or disagree that America should continue to open her border to immigrants? Versus this question. With the increasing risk of national security, should America enforce stricter immigration policies in order to keep her citizens safe? Okay, these are such leading questions because the first question you read and you think, oh, we should do that, leave the borders open. And then the second question makes you, it kind of strikes fear into a person and makes them think, no, 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 we should not, we need stricter immigration policies. So the way that you word your question is really important in in a, in a survey. So poor wording of questions brings about measurement or response bias. And here's something to always keep in mind. You might have selected your sample to represent the population quite well, but if your measuring tool brings about a biased response, your data is worthless. Sometimes people think, well, I'll just increase my sample size. Then you have more worthless data. Your wording of your question is very important. There's a polling organization called Gallup that you will probably talk about in class one day. And Gallup polls are actually very good. And when they, a lot of times they'll ask questions and they test their questions. So what they'll do is they'll do a random sample and they'll have, as one of their survey questions, they'll have a question they want to know about, and then they'll change the wording on some of the other ones, and they see if they get similar results to see if their questions are going to lead to response bias. So really important that your questions don't lead someone towards a particular answer, because you want to make sure that that's why it's called a response bias, because people tend to respond a certain way because of the way the question is worded. So multi-stage sample. One way to get a sample of all high school students in America is to do this in stages. And stage one might be take a sample from the 3,000 counties in the United States. So you could do like a random sample of all 3,000 counties in the US. Stage two, you select a sample of high schools within each county. So you select a certain number of counties, then you select a sample of high school student or high schools within each county. And then another stage, you could select a sample of students within each high school. Now, any of those samples could be a simple random sample or a stratified within those stages. But a multi-stage sample is a way that you can kind of narrow it down and still use good sampling techniques. In our example, the population and the sampling frame were the same, a list of students at Delphus Jefferson High School. Suppose we wanted the opinion of all the Delphus residents and we used the phone book as the sampling frame. Some of you are like, what's a phone book? Why is this sampling frame not the same as the population? There's a lot of people who have unlisted phone numbers, and so there is no phone book. You can't find their phone number anywhere. And so that would end up being selection bias or undercoverage because some people are not listed in the phone book. And that is the end of chapter 12. So again, lots of vocabulary. So hopefully you have filled out the reading guide, read the required pages, and we will continue on with some examples during our next class session.